right, it's time. Let's get started. Welcome to this session, the last session before lunch, called Be the Automator, Not the Automated. My name is Egil Ring. I work at a company called Crayon in Norway, and I'm also a Microsoft MVP. The agenda for this talk is we're going to talk a little bit in the beginning about what it takes to be a modern IT pro. Then we're going to look at some toolings. And the main part of this presentation is going to be going through a demo scenario using those specific tools. And the scenario is automated user on and offboarding. I suppose many of you have seen these circles before. Everything is about continuous management. So when you get a new service or product into management in your organization, after you have installed it and have it up and running, it's not finished. It will just go in this circle of continuous improvement. It will come a new version someday. You will need to make sure you have a governance, you have backup, you have routines to operate this the service. So it's kind of the same principles as the DevOps lifecycle is also applicable to DevOps. So really, all of those working in IT today, they have some job in front of them with regards to adapting to this new way of thinking, because the old school where you have devs on one side and operators on the other side doesn't work when the organization is moving into a modern cloud infrastructure. So what we need to do is to start merged, use the same tools on both sides. Everyone should use source control, even if you're not considering yourself a developer. Put your scripts into source control. Learn the basics of Git, and everything will be much better to track and operate. Also, you can use many of the same services as the operators for example, continuous deployment of PowerShell modules, virtual machines, anything that you manage as an IT pro. And also when you're moving into cloud environments such as Azure or any other cloud, the same principles apply. So it doesn't matter which one your organization is using. So DevOps is the union of people, process and tools to enable continuous delivery of value to our customers. That's the key. That's what we want to achieve with these principles. So as I said, I'm going to show you some examples in this presentation where we're going to use some specific tools to show how we can accomplish to solve this specific task of automating user onboarding, offboarding. So as a front-end, we are going to use a service from Microsoft called Power Apps. It's available in the Office 365 suite. I built this scenario for a customer who was using Microsoft services. They were using Azure, built many of the services on the Microsoft portfolio. So it made sense for the customer to use Microsoft tooling for this scenario. But of course, you can replace them with any other tool, for example, Jenkins for the CI/CD part, for example. So this is just an example how we can solve it using these tools. So if we start with one of the tools, Visual Studio Team Services, it's formerly known as Visual Studio Online. It's the cloud edition of TFS, Team Foundation Server, which is the on-premise version if you need to run it on-premise. So Microsoft's definition of done, it's when it's live in production, a service is live in production, it's collecting telemetry that examines the hypothesis with motivated deployment. So all of this is also about continuous delivery. You have to monitor and learn, release a new version, develop new features based on bug reports, feature requests from customers, and so on. Plan the new features, and you go through the same circle again and again. You monitor, collect telemetry, and do the same things. So even though we are not developers per se, we are IT pros, which is tipping our toes into the developer world, we don't have to use every feature of Visual Studio Team Services. We can use just a few of them to get started with, for instance, the planning phase, building a release pipeline, and so on. So I'm going to hop over to the demo to show you how you can use the basics of VSTS as an IT pro. Here I'm going to hop into visualstudio.com in a demo environment. So when you log onto this, you can log on to it using your Azure AD account or Microsoft account. You create what's called a project. So you can, for example, create one project dedicated to infrastructure or infrastructure automation and have everything in one project. Or you can separate it into, for example, one project for configuration management, one for PowerShell modules. That's totally up to you. But in this example, we are using one project for everything. So if you go into the project, let's just see if it connects there. You'll get an overview. And what I'm going to show you first, you will get some overview of what work is assigned to you and so on. What I'm going to start with is the work feature. So here you can start to create work, what is called work items. And here we have several different types. What we're going to start with is what's called a user story. So this is what are we trying to solve. So in this scenario, it's creating a self-service solution for on- and offboarding users, which will be the user story. And then we're adding features on top of that. So let's go into the user story that I created here. So here we provide a description. For example, what I had in the slides, the tooling we're going to use, what should be the acceptance criteria, what is the criteria for this being a working solution when it's done and ready for production. So this is the user story. And then we have features for all of the other things. For instance, create the Power App, create a runbook, PowerShell runbook for doing the actual work, the breakdown of the features, and we can go ahead and assign these features to different people. In this example, I'm assigned to everything, but in a typical team, you would give different tasks to different team members. And also after you have this solution ready, you can use these features to track bugs, for example. You can create a work item of the type bug, and here is an example of a bug item where for instance, the new Azure AD user didn't properly convert users with Norwegian letters, for instance. And if you go back to the work items, you can also see, if you go here, that you have the possibility to go into an overview. If you look at the board, so you have an overview over a Kanban board, basically, over all of the tasks, so you can see where are we in a bigger picture. So for instance, this is just drag and drop, so when you're finished with something, just resolve it. And this is nice for project managers or the team themselves to keep track of the state of the work. Next, we have code. So here we have support for Git repositories. When you create a project, you get one default repository, but you can create additional ones as needed. But here I'm keeping it simple. I'm just using the one Git repository. So here you can see all of the code is available in the browser, but here we can simply go and clone it. So if you open Visual Studio Code, git clone, create a demo folder. So now we can see that it's cloning the repository at the bottom left, and it will ask us if we want to open it in a few seconds. Yeah, I don't know what happened there, but I have it pre-downloaded here, I think, there. Yeah, so here we have the same repository locally. So we can continue to work with the PowerShell scripts and runbooks and all of the assets we have locally as we are used to. So here you just pull and push changes as you're used to when you're working with Git against GitHub or any other Git provider. Back to VSTS. The next thing I wanted to show you is the build and release. Builds is typically something you are using when you are building software and you have to compile it into an DLL or executable, for example. But in this case, I'm just using the release feature to deploy some Azure Automation runbooks into Azure Automation. But this could be the deployment of a PowerShell module to an internal PowerShell gallery, or any other scenario you might have. So here I have a release definition called publish runbooks to Azure Automation. You can go and edit it to see how it looks like. Here we have to first map it to an artifact. So the artifact is the Git repository, and when you enable this continuous deployment trigger, you state that you want a build or a release to be triggered when a Git commit is being done to that repository. Here I have just one environment, but you could of course set up dev test on more environments. Let's go and look into the 4 different tasks we have here. Here the first one is to run some pester tests. So if you go back to the repository, you can see that I have this invoke pester test script that will be run. And it's storing the output in NUnit XML, meaning that we can put the results back into VSTS and get it analyzed in the website. So these tests, it's a couple of them. It's the PowerShell script analyzer rules that it goes through for all of the runbooks inside of this repository. We have a couple of them. And the next one is just a dummy test, basically. Here we would put more logic into what should be tested. But this is just an example. Then we have the test pester results that generates the XML files. And if you go back to the VSTS, the next thing we are going to do when we run the test, we have to publish them. So the test was named with results.xml at the end of the name. So it will basically grab all of the files it can find on the build runner and publish them back to VSTS. Then we are going to analyze the results that was uploaded. And based on if those succeeded or not, you can decide whether you want to continue with publishing the runbooks. So for instance, if everything went fine with all of the tests, we can go ahead and publish our runbooks directly to Azure Automation. And in this example, we are using the native Azure Resource Manager connection, so I don't have to set up any authentication inside of the script that will sync the runbooks, because it will be automatically authenticated using this native credentials. So this is the script that will just go ahead and publish it using the native Azure Resource Manager PowerShell commandlets. So you can see that I have no add Azure RM account in here because it's automatically authenticated. Here you can see that I hard-coded the values for the automation account and resource group, but this could, of course, also be brought into variables or, yeah. That was it. If you go and have a look at the release that has to run, if you look at the last one, we can open it. So this was triggered the last time I did a commit to the repository. You can go ahead and look in the logs and see that it pulled down the artifacts. It's downloaded the Git repository and went through all the steps I just showed you. So if any errors happened, you would see it here. And here you can also see it. For example, 11 tests failed. It was 11 script analyzer rules that failed. And then you can get the details here, and you also get the automatically generated statistics for your tests. But this succeeded. If this succeeded, it will be published to the gallery or to Azure Automation account automatically. So this is what's being used as the backend for storing the Azure Automation runbooks. We'll talk a little bit more about Azure Automation later on. So now we have one component in our story ready. It's the CI/CD component. Next, we're going to talk about the front end. The front end that the users that are going to order new accounts are going to use. That's something called Power Apps. Have anybody used Power Apps before? A few of you? Not many? Okay, good. Then you can show what it's about. It's a cloud-first cross-platform component from Microsoft. So you basically install Power Apps on your phone from the App Store on your phone. And inside of that Power App, you get the Power Apps that we are going to create now. For instance, one for user onboarding, one for user offboarding, and so on. So it's very easy to author. It's what you see is what you get editor. So you don't have to be a developer to author a Power App. It's very, very easy. I'm going to show you a demo very soon. Also, for instance, when you click on a button or perform some actions inside of the app, you get these Excel-like expressions. So if you're used to expressions in Excel, it will be very familiar. Also, there are integrations to over 160 data sources, so you can integrate this with OneDrive, SharePoint, many integrations that is available out of the box, and you can also integrate with custom ones. So what scenarios? You can customize and extend existing apps. Scenarios where you have some people going on site and do some inspections, and you want to just type in some data into a database or something. Or focused task-based experiences, which is basically what we are doing here with the user onboarding scenario. So let's go in and have a look at how this looks like. We start by going to powerapps.com. Here you also authenticate using your Azure AD account. On apps, I'm just going to show you how you create an app before we go into the user onboarding app that is pre-created. So when you create a new one, you can either start with a blank template, or you have many different pre-built templates. For instance, we have someone for service desk scenarios, site inspection, and so on, which have many pre-built components. But in this scenario, I'm just going to go back and create one from blank. So we should create an app and start with a blank one. One of the things you can start by doing is selecting a theme. You have some pre-built themes in here. We can start to insert some text or some buttons. So for instance, just a label. User onboarding, for instance. So you create some forms here to collect the data, and then you maybe will create a button to perform the actual order. So just give it a name, order. You can also create additional screens here. So for instance, if you insert screen 2 that we see there, go back to screen 1. So here you can state what should happen when the user pushes the button. So here you can, for instance, type navigate, and we want him to navigate to screen 2. And we have to choose, here you can see that I get some help that I need to also specify the transition. So we want the transition to be fading. And this is it. I don't have to type anything else, but if I also wanted to perform additional actions, I could have specified a semicolon and added more actions. So let's just go ahead and run this and see what will happen. Here you can see that it's running. Pressing the order button, it will jump to the second screen, which didn't have any content in this example. Another thing, you can also put in pictures, icons, a lot of multimedia things. You can also connect a lot of data sources. So for instance, you can connect it to a SharePoint list that we will do afterwards, or an Excel table, for instance. If you just have some static data, you can define it in Excel on your local computer and just add it to your application. Or you can use what's called a common data service, which is a service that is created to be used with Power Apps and Flow and Logic Apps, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So let's go out of this one. Here we can give it a name and just save it. You can also specify an icon and things like that. So the things you specify here is what the user will see on his phone, for instance, when we have access to the app. So let's just go ahead and save it. Call it app1. Sorry, thank you. There we go. So now we're going to have a look at our pre-built app. That's called user onboarding. If I press the share this app button, you get the opportunity to share it with specific users or specific groups within your Azure AD. So let's open the user onboarding app. So here you can see that we have inserted a logo and some information, and we have this plus button which the user can press, and here we see what will happen is that he will navigate to the screen called Edit Screen 1. So let's scroll down to that. If you go into this, you can see that it's going to collect some data, first name, last name, and everything we need for creating a user. So this is things that will eventually become available for the PowerShell runbook that is going to create the user. When the user presses the button, it will be submitted, and he will get a confirmation that your request has been registered, and he will receive an email when it has been processed. So let's just go ahead and run it to test it. Now I'm just running it from the web browser. I could also install it, I also have it installed on Windows 10. It's available from the Microsoft Store app, or the user can use it from his phone, as I said. So let's go ahead and create a test user. Here we go. The manager, so this is a lookup property, so when I type something, it will look up to the users in my Azure AD tenant. So we'll set myself as the manager. So this will be configured as the manager eventually in the runbook. And you also have some optional properties there. But for instance, you can take different decisions based on what category the user is. And notice here we will come back to this company field in the next demonstration on the SharePoint side, but here you could have a drop-down with different companies or different departments if you wanted. So let's go ahead and create this user. All right, and let's just go out of the application and back to the demo. So that's Power Apps in a nutshell. So that's going to be the front end for our scenario. And it's also easy to integrate it many places. For instance, if you're using Microsoft Teams, you can add a Power App as a tab there, so it's very accessible for the users. It's also possible to embed them in the Power BI dashboards, so it's a lot of flexibility. Question?
So if you integrate this in Teams, you get a direct access to this app in the Teams?
Yeah, correct. It will be a tab inside of a Teams channel. Yeah. So when one more question?
Yeah, but the testing part from users to your team services, do you need build machines for testing the script?
The question is whether I need build machines for testing the scripts. You get out of box, you get access to, if you don't specify anything, it will be run on a build server inside of Microsoft's offering. But if you wanted or have any dependencies on local testing, for instance, you need to test against your local Active Directory, you could install a VSTS agent on an on-premise server and specify that the test should run on that machine. So you have some flexibility there. But for the testing, the demo I'm showing here, everything is running in Azure because I'm just creating users in Azure Active Directory. But yeah, that's a good question. So now we have VSTS and we have Power Apps. The next thing we're going to introduce is the data store. When the user hit the button in the Power App, where is it going to be stored? For this, we're using a very simple component in SharePoint, a SharePoint list to store the data, because there are very good integration between Power Apps and Logic Apps, which we'll talk about in a minute, and Flow. So let's go back into the demo environment and have a look at the SharePoint list. If you start by looking at the list called company, if you remember the drop-down that you got in the Power App, you remember that we had one company, but if you added more companies here, those would be available in that drop-down list. So here you have, for instance, data about the company, such as the street address and everything like that. Next, we are going to go into the user onboarding list. So this is where the requests are coming in. So here you can see the user I typed in a few minutes ago. It's added to the list. If you look a little bit to the right there, you can see that the company data is also available here without the user specifying anything. Because if you go into the list settings, where you can define as an administrator, you can define which columns should be inside of the SharePoint list. We have this concept of lookup properties. So I can specify that I want a lookup property against another list, which was the company list, and then I can extract properties from that list into the properties on this list. So this is things we basically get for free when the user chose one company. All of the properties for that company will be available on the new user in the list, or the new item in the list. So that's a very handy feature when using SharePoint lists. So if you look to the right there, every information about the user, the company it belongs to, is available here. So of course you could go ahead and create users manually here, but here we have this integration with Power App. So you don't actually have to create the app that I showed you manually. If you just press create an app here, it will create an app that is very similar with all of the data form connections and things like that against the SharePoint list. It's pre-built, so it's very easy to get started. If you have a SharePoint list, just press this button and do some testing, and it won't use very long to get this working. So when the user hits the submit button in the Power App, what's happening is actually that the data he typed in the Power App will be written in this list. And you can notice that it got an ID, so this ID will be important when working with the PowerShell runbook that will retrieve this data, because the ID is what the runbook will use to look up the user it is going to create. So just remember that the ID was 13. And the workflow status, that is also a custom property that I just made up for this scenario for tracking state. So for instance, if the runbook is started several times, if the workflow status is, for instance, failed or something other than new, it will just abort to avoid to have some control of the workflow itself. So that was the SharePoint list. The next thing that we need is some trigger mechanism. So when something is added to the SharePoint list, we need something to trigger the automation, the PowerShell runbook. So that brings us to the next tool in our scenario, which is Azure Logic Apps. So Azure Logic Apps, it's basically the evolvement of the BizTalk server that Microsoft has had an on-prem tool for a long time. It's the modern cloud version of that, which makes integrations between systems much easier. So this is you can create workflows with triggers and actions. You see the workflow editor in the screenshot there. So it's meant for integrations between systems, basically. It can be used to many different things, but as an IT pro, there are also many very interesting scenarios you can use it for, because there are integrations against, for example, Azure Automation that we're going to look at now. So based on some trigger, you can create an action called the Start Azure Automation Runbook, for example. So this is Microsoft's hybrid integration platform. So if you need to do something from a Logic app against local data, such as Active Directory or the things mentioned here, you can actually install an on-premises data gateway to also interact with data that is on-premise. So this Logic Apps, this is a serverless component, which makes it a very attractive cloud component. Reduce DevOps, reduce time to market, and you only pay for each action, per action billing. So it's not very costly for the things we are using it for here, at least. And you also have connections against a lot of things. For instance, it's not shown here, but you have against Dropbox, OneDrive, FTP servers, lot of different connectors that you get out of the box, several hundreds. And also you can mash this together with different services. It's just your imagination that is the limits, basically. So this is also a lot of the services you can see here are focused on developers, but a lot of them but the Logic app itself can be used by IT pros for many creative scenarios. So let's go and have a quick look at how this looks like. Then we have to go into the Azure portal. So we go to portal.azure.com. On the left side, you will have to look for Logic apps. If you don't see it, you can just click on all services and search for Logic apps, and you will find it. So go into Logic apps, we create a new one. Call it, for instance, PSConf EU demo. And you have to put it in our resource group. And you have to select a location. So while this is being created in a few seconds, when it's created, it will be available in this list. And the first time I click on it to go into it, it will bring you directly to the designer, because you have to define how the app should look like. So the first time you go into there, I would recommend that you have a quick look at the demo. It's like 1-2 minutes. Have a look at the documentation. But basically, you get access to several common triggers. So you can do things when, for instance, a tweet is posted, files added to an FTP, and so on. But in this example, I'm just going to start with a blank Power App. Select, for instance, SharePoint that we're using here. So here you can select when an item is created. So this will be when a new user is added to our SharePoint list. Here you have to set up authentication. When that is done, you can go ahead and search for a different connector. For instance, here you can see the long list of all of the connectors that is here. I'm going to search for automation. Then we should find Azure Automation, and here you see that you can create a new job in Azure Automation. So here you also have to sign in. Here we would typically connect with a service principal or a service user. I guess a service principal would be the optimal. Select subscription, resource group, where the automation account resides. And then you will get a list of all of the runbooks that is available in that automation account. So you just select, here I have a runbook called new Azure AD user, which will be used for this scenario. And when you press on the runbook, find it here, you will also dynamically, the parameters here are dynamically gotten from the PowerShell runbook. So this is parameters that I have specified inside of PowerShell, just like you do in a PowerShell script. So these are dynamically added here, so you can specify the values. So the important thing here is the SharePoint list ID for the new user. You can remember that the new user we created got the number 13, which we don't want to hardcode here. So here we are adding a reference to what we get from the SharePoint list. So if you go out of this one, I can show you the pre-built one where everything is set up correctly. If you go into the user onboarding, and we go into the Logic App Designer on the left. So here you can see when an item is created, and you can specify how often it will look for it. By default, it's 3 minutes. Then we're going to get the company from the company list to know which user is going to approve it, because here you also have the benefit that you get approval. So here you can send, here I'm just sending a notification email to the user about notifying it that we are waiting for the CEO to accept, the CEO of the company to accept the request. Next, we're sending the approval email. So here we are specifying some information that will be sent to the CEO for the company that the user is going to be created in, with the options approve or reject, information about the user. So this is data that is injected from the previous step, from the SharePoint list. So when I press here, you can see that I get the options on the right here to dynamically insert fields from the SharePoint list item. If it is approved, we go down to a switch. On this switch, based on the selected option, if it's approved, we're going to create a job in Azure Automation. And here you can see that we are specifying the ID from the SharePoint list as the parameter for the new employee ID. so that the runbook knows which user to pick from the list and get the correct data for creating the user. And if it was denied, we simply send an email to the requester that the manager declined it. So how does this look like? We can, if we go back to the overview, we can see that we have one running now because a few minutes ago I created a new user, so that triggered this logic app within 3 minutes, so it's running. So if we go into the running instance, we should see that it's waiting for the approval. So here we can see that it found the item in the SharePoint list, it got the company data from the company list, and now it's sent an email. So if I check my mailbox, I should hopefully find a couple of emails here. Here we can see first the email sent to the user. It's waiting for the company CEO to approve it, and the company CEO will receive this email. And this is of course something that you can make prettier and insert. I think you can insert HTML here to make the text more easy, but this is just a proof of concept, just to show you how it looks like. And if I press this approve button, you can see that it states that it has registered my response. And if you go back to the logic app, it should continue the result that it continued, and hopefully started the Azure automation job. So, and with the correct ID, the number 13. So if we are quick and go over to the automation account, you can hopefully see that their job has been triggered. So go into the automation account, go to jobs, and here you can see that a new job is running now. And if I go into the output, you can see that here it's calculated PowerShell custom object with the information from the company data. So this is something I can use when I populate a new user in Azure AD to insert the correct street address and everything without the requester having to specify it. And we have another custom object called user data, where we have every data from the SharePoint list and also some calculated properties, such as the user principal name, which is calculated in regular PowerShell. And also you can see that the user is being added to different groups there based on the PS custom object that specifies that the user should have, for instance, Office 365 licenses. So based on those things, the runbook will add the user to a Azure Active Directory group, which is using a group-based licensing feature in Azure AD, which will add the correct licenses to the user based on the group membership. So I don't have to handle the licensing part in the runbook. I just add it to the correct groups in Azure AD, and the managed or Azure will take care of everything else. Here you can see that it's finished, and it's sending a notification to the requester. In this case, I'm also sending the randomly generated password to the requester via email, but in production you maybe want to use some different mechanism for sending the password, such as an SMS or something like that. Also, before we go from the topic of logic apps, I just wanted to mention the difference between Flow and logic apps. Because if you've been using Microsoft Flow, the designer looks exactly the same because it's the same engine behind it. But an important difference between Flow and logic apps is that in Flow, the runbooks will start in the context of the end user, meaning it would be a bad idea to use it for our scenario, because then the end user would need to have permissions to start the runbook in Azure Automation account. And we don't want end users to go into an Azure Automation account and have access there. But with logic apps, you can use a service principal or a service account or a custom credentials. So for enterprise environments, in my opinion, it makes sense to put logic apps into an Azure subscription, because there you get the benefit of the management scope of Azure to use permission delegation using Azure AD, resource group, Azure policies for naming conventions, and so on. So that's kind of the difference between the two, although they are using the same engine. And last but not least, after we have our workflow engine, Azure Logic Apps, we have Azure Automation and PowerShell that we saw our runbook was starting. So I guess I don't have to introduce Azure Automation too much for this audience, but in a nutshell, it's an automation account gives you different management features. You can manage servers or physical servers, VMs, anything that you can install an agent on. From this service, you have configuration management, which is basically PowerShell desired state configuration. You have update management, which is patching of servers. It supports both Linux and Windows. And then you have process automation, what these people are used to thinking about with regards to Azure Automation, which is basically runbooks. So you put your PowerShell scripts into a runbook and adjust it a little bit, and it can be run as a runbook inside of Azure. One important thing to also mention here is that we have the concept of a hybrid worker, like we could in VSTS. We can install an agent on an on-premise server, one or more, in order to run our runbooks on our on-premise environment. So you don't have to set up a VPN or anything like that. You can just install that hybrid worker, and it will listen for new requests from Azure Automation. So when you start a job in Azure Automation and specify that you want to run it on a hybrid worker, it will actually be downloaded and executed on the hybrid worker. So I'm not going to, this is just for your reference, how you set up that. It's very easy. You install the Microsoft monitoring agent, run this couple of commands, and then it will be registered in the automation account. So I guess we have already looked at Azure Automation, but I can just show you a couple more things here. You can see the input that the SharePoint list ID 13 was added. But here you also have many different things, such as you can add credentials, you can add variables and things like that you can use inside of your runbooks. But that's kind of out of scope for this presentation. I just wanted to show you the runbook that we used for the user onboarding scenario. So that's about, now I have completed all of the gone through all of the 5 tooling components that we've chosen for our scenario. The offboarding process would be, of course, exactly the same, except for that you would create a separate Power App, separate SharePoint list, and separate Logic App, and so on. I also have a flow chart for how everything works with regards to the flow. I don't expect you to see it. It's more like a reference to what is happening. When a new user request, it will go to the Power App, to the SharePoint list, wait for approval, kick off the runbook, and so on. So this is just a reference for the flow of it. So to sum up, there are building blocks for us as IT pros in public clouds, such as Azure that we just saw, that we can use to build solutions for solving problems or needs for our company. Many of the patterns and practices can be reused internally. For instance, use source control, no matter what you're working with, SQL, no matter what topic. Release management and continuous integration and delivery, that will become more and more important in the coming years, I believe, since more and more is defined as code. So the key takeaway from this session is that you have to start automate. I guess everyone in this room knows it, but when you get back to your environment, your coworkers, probably or customers, will need to start looking into automation. It will become more and more important. But sadly, some people are just too busy to automate. But that's the way it is. Also have my contact details in the slides, or I guess you have a few minutes for questions if you have any. Yeah.
So, what step do you do all your tests? I mean, check for if the user is already there.
Yeah, that's a good question. So Yeah, thank you. The question is, what tool do I use for testing? For instance, if the user already exists inside of Azure AD, I can show you. inside of the runbook. So if you have a look here at the new Azure AD user runbook, blow it up a little bit. So here all of the logic basically relies in regular PowerShell code. So I'm just checking get Azure AD user -all, get everything from AD or filter for the user. So all of the logic is here. Probably this should be broken down to a module, for instance, creating a test Azure AD user or something. But here it's just a large runbook. But ideally you would create it more granular. So here you can see the custom object for the company data and so on, created as a custom object. Yeah. Yes? Can you validate the input from a Power App? That's a good question. In this scenario, I just used the create Power App option from the SharePoint list, so I didn't really handcraft it much myself. But I don't know the answer to that. I will have to look up the Power App documentation. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
You created this awesome thing by clicking a lot.
Yeah.
Is it possible to create this on PowerShell too?
Yes, as you know, everything inside of Azure is possible to define using resource manager templates. So if you go into, for instance, the user onboarding, here you can have a look at the logic app code view. So it's you can do it, but yeah, it's
Create the code for you.
yeah. Other questions? Yes. What license model does Power Apps have? On the top of my head, I think it's included in some of the typical Office 365 SKUs like E1, and E2, and E3. So you just need the most basic Power Apps license for the scenarios we are using here. There are some different SKUs for Power Apps for more advanced scenarios, but I don't think the pricing is very high for the scenario we are talking about here. Other questions? Yes?
Is it also a way to execute these Azure runbooks against on-premise Active Directory?
Is it also possible to execute these runbooks against an on-premise Active Directory? Yes, I can show you if you go into the automation account that we have here. We have this concept of a hybrid worker. So you basically install the Microsoft, if you press the configure button here, it will tell you exactly what to do. You need to have a OMS workspace. You have to install the Microsoft monitoring or Microsoft management agent on the on-premise machine where you want to enable the hybrid runbook worker. So typically you designate one or more on-premise servers as hybrid runbook workers. And then you configure it by running the 2 PowerShell commands that I showed you in the presentation. And when you have done that, it will show up here in the hybrid runbook worker group. So here you can see that I have a runbook worker group with 1 worker, but for redundancy you typically would like to set up 2 or more. And if you go back to the runbooks and we just pick a random runbook and we press the start button to launch it manually, you have the option here to where you want to run it, either on Azure, on a sandbox worker, or a hybrid worker, which is one of the servers that you just configured. So that's pretty easy to do without any VPN to your on-premise environment or anything. I think it's just HTTPS that needs to be open against the Azure automation endpoints. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.